Welcome to Session 3 of Clocks and Registers. For the first exercise, we're asked to add a clear to a counter. We recognize that at each clock, the output becomes whatever is at the input to each flip-flop, and therefore, we would like to add an input signal, clear, that forces each flop input to 0. And that, of course, is a simple AND gate. Next, we need to create a counter that counts down instead of up. In other words, for this 3-bit counter, and starting at, for example, 7, it would count down through 6, 5, 4, etc. First off, we recognize that the first stage, the LS bit, just toggles up and down, just like the up counter. So we add an inverter to the first stage feedback, just like in an up counter. Next, we see that the second stage transitions whenever the first stage is low. We remember that with an up counter, the second stage is inverted via its XOR when the first stage is high. And we can see that we need to invert the first stage at the XOR. Thus, when the first stage is low, the input to the XOR is high, and the second stage then toggles. We can, alternatively, show the inversion with a bubble at the XOR input. We finally come to the third stage, and we find that it toggles when both the first and second stage are low together. And we recognize that as an AND gate with an inverted inputs. From here, we see how we would add additional stages. Each stage transitions when all the previous stages are low. The last problem asks us to create a counter that counts both up and down. We'll start with a down counter, recognizing, as we just discovered, that a counter that counts down has inversions in the feedback paths. Remembering that XOR gates give us controllable inversions, we replace each inversion with one. Now we just need to control them. We're obviously looking to control them using the up-down control signal input of the block. From the nomenclature, we deduce that we want the counter to count down when the signal is low. We get that from the lowercase n of the signal name. And since we just saw that the counter counts down when the inputs to our added XOR gates are high, we add an inverter to the up-down input signal. In this session, we explore registers used as latches. We begin with our ubiquitous D flip-flop, and as we know, the output follows the set input 1 clock delayed. What happens, though, if we loop the output back through an OR gate? The feedback loop keeps the output high even when the input goes away. We've created a registered latch, which in this configuration is fine if all we want to know is whether the set input ever, even just once, went high after we powered up our circuit. Beyond that very specialized use, this is pretty limited though. We can add another input signal that we'll call reset. And if it goes high, we break the latched condition and force the output back low. But what happens if both set and reset go active at the same time? The AND gate forces the flop's D input low, regardless of anything else, and the output never goes high. We say that the reset input has precedence. If we rearrange the circuit, placing the OR gate closer to the flop, then the set input has precedence and the output goes active. All that I've done here is rearrange our circuit to make a little room. I add an AND gate to the set and reset inputs and introduce a new input called enable. You can see that neither the set nor the reset inputs work unless the enable is active. Thus, the enable could block the reset from clearing the latch arrangement, in which case it's more of a disable than an enable. Or the enable could block the set from ever forcing the latch high in the first place. In practical applications, though, we usually find the enable either active, allowing the latch to operate as a set or a reset, or the enable might be inactive for long periods, essentially disabling the latch, leaving it in whatever state it was when the enable went inactive. We can collect the circuit together in a symbol with a set, an enable, and a reset. Next, we'll look at a fairly simple but common and useful function. This time, we start with the humble OR gate. We add two AND gates, one with an inverted input, and label two inputs, A and B. And finally, we add a control signal that we call select. When select is low, the A signal finds its way through to the output. And when select is high, the B is, well, selected. We call this gate arrangement a multiplexer since it multiplexes the two signals onto one signal. And we usually abbreviate it to just MUX. This is the common symbol. We now bring our D flop and MUX together. When the enable signal is high, the input is fed to the flop, and the output follows the input. But when the select enable input is low, the flop's output is fed right back. And the D flop holds whatever was the state when the enable went inactive. We've created an enabled register, and its symbol looks like this. Next, we take, say, 4 enabled registers together. Note that I've removed the Q output label. At this point, it's assumed we know that this port is the register's output. We add a clock and an enable signal connected to all the registers in a group. And lastly, we bring along a 4-bit data bus and pass it through the register group. We often collapse the data bus connections like this, where these might be assumed to be the order of connection. But taking the condensing even further, we can collapse the registers themselves together, where, because we're registering a 4-bit data bus, it's assumed that this represents 4 separate registers. So let's take a look at how this would work. given an input vector data bus with this sequence of values coming, perhaps, from one of the counters we previously created. We understand that the output will transition, if it's going to transition, at each rising clock edge, and will apply an enable that looks like this. We can see that while the enable is active, the values 1, 2, and 3 will appear out of the register 1 clock after the inputs. We don't know here what the outputs are before the enable goes active, since we don't know what they were when the enable previously went inactive. We do know, though, that when this enable goes inactive, the output is frozen at the last value, 3. Arriving here at data buses controlled using enabled registers brings us to the threshold of exploring the types of circuits actually used in today's devices. And now, what you've been waiting for,